The first thing you learn in the West is that promises are worth less than the dust that coats them. Eleanor Hayes learned that lesson the hard way. She stepped off that stagecoach in Foul Ridge with a single carpet bag and a stack of letters from a man named Samuel Morrison. Letters that spoke of a homestead, good soil, and a new life waiting for her. She'd sold everything she owned back in Ohio, bet her entire future on the ink scrawled on that paper. But Samuel Morrison was a ghost. Been gone, the townsfolk shrugged. 2 months, maybe 3. His plot of land was empty. The promise had turned to ash in her mouth, tasting bitter as gunpowder. She was alone, broke, and stranded in a town that felt like the edge of the world. And that's when she saw the cage. It sat in the middle of the town square, a monstrous thing of iron and fear, 8 feet tall, with bars as thick as a man's arm. It wasn't for an animal. It was for a man. Inside, a figure sat hunched in the corner, head bowed, so still he might have been a statue carved from shadow and grief. Chains ran from heavy shackles on his wrists to the floor of the cage. He was a spectacle, a warning. "What did he do?" a newcomer whispered. The answer came back in a hushed, fearful tone. "Killed a man, up in the mountains. They say he went wild, after what happened to his family." Eleanor pushed through the gawking crowd, drawn by a morbid curiosity she couldn't explain. The sun beat down on that iron box, turning it into an oven. How could anything survive in there? "Why keep him like an animal?" she heard herself ask out loud. A woman beside her snorted. "Because that's what he is. They found him living in a cave, hadn't spoken a word in years. When they tried to bring him in, it took 6 men to hold him down." The woman leaned closer, her voice dropping. "They found bones in that cave, human bones, and the wagon belonging to the Garrett family, the ones who went missing last winter." Eleanor looked closer at the man. His stillness wasn't animalistic. It was controlled, deliberate. Animals pace, they snarl. This man sat like he was already dead inside. "Move along, folks!" Sheriff Bradley's voice boomed. "Nothing more to see here." The crowd started to drift away, but Eleanor stayed rooted to the spot. She'd known cruel men, her father, her late husband. They had a look in their eyes, a twitch of violence just waiting to be unleashed. This man had none of that. All she saw was brokenness. The sheriff noticed her. "Ma'am, I said move along." "Is he fed?" Eleanor asked, her voice surprisingly steady. "Is he given water?" The sheriff's face reddened. "Of course he is. We ain't barbarians. Now get." "I'd like to speak with him." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Lady, that man ain't said a word since we brought him in. Won't even give us his name. Besides, he's dangerous. Last fella who got too close nearly lost a finger." "He's in a cage," Eleanor pointed out, but she was already walking toward it, ignoring the sheriff's curses behind her. She stopped just out of arm's reach. The man didn't look up. "Sir?" she said softly. "Nothing." She turned back to the sheriff. "What was his actual crime? Not rumors about bones. What evidence do you have?" Sheriff Bradley's jaw worked. "He killed Tom Garrett. We found him standing over the body, blood on his hands." "Was it self-defense?" "Don't matter. Tom Garrett was a respected man. Had a wife, 3 kids. This thing took him from them." Eleanor looked at the caged man again. She saw a thin line of dried blood on his temple. His hands weren't the hands of a brawler. They were scarred with the calluses of hard labor. A carpenter, maybe, or a blacksmith. "What will happen to him?" "Judge'll hang him," the sheriff spat, "though some folks are calling for worse. Tom Garrett had a lot of friends." A cold knot formed in Eleanor's stomach. She'd come west to escape injustice, only to find it squatting right here in the middle of town. Her first husband had been shot in the back over a land dispute. The law did nothing, said there wasn't enough evidence. Now here was the law, holding a man in a cage, ready to hang him on fear and hearsay. Without thinking, she reached into her carpet bag. Her fingers closed around the small cloth bundle inside. The last thing of value she owned. Her wedding ring. She hadn't kept it for sentiment. She'd kept it for an emergency. And this, she realized, was an emergency. "Sheriff Bradley," she said. her voice ringing with a certainty that startled even herself. I want to make you a proposition. She pulled out the ring, letting the dusty gold catch the afternoon light. The sheriff stared at it, then at her, confused. But Eleanor wasn't just talking to him anymore. She turned, raising her voice to address the crowd that was starting to gather again, drawn by the new drama. You all believe in justice, don't you? She called out. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the onlookers. Then you must believe in mercy too. In redemption. She held the ring high. I'm offering to marry this man. A stunned silence fell over the square. It was so quiet you could hear the wind kicking up dust devils down the street. Then someone laughed, a harsh, disbelieving bark that broke the spell. Soon the whole square was ringing with mockery. She's lost her mind. Touched by the sun, she is. Marry that thing. You'd be dead before morning. But Eleanor stood her ground. She had faced down her father's fists and the cold silence of an entire town after her husband's murder. This was nothing. She looked back at the caged man, and that's when she saw it. His head had lifted, just enough for her to see his eyes through the dark, matted hair. They were gray as a winter storm, and they held a pain so deep it stole her breath. In that moment, she knew she was right. I am of sound mind, she shouted, silencing the crowd, and I know what I'm offering. This man needs someone to vouch for him, or you'll hang him based on nothing but fear. I will take that responsibility. If he is the monster you say, then I will be the one to suffer for it. But if he is not, the silence that followed was heavy, charged with disbelief and a strange, grudging respect. Even Sheriff Bradley seemed at a loss for words. He stared at her, then at the ring in her hand, then at the man in the cage who was now watching her, really watching her, for the first time. You don't even know his name, the sheriff protested, his voice weak. Do you? Eleanor shot back. The sheriff had no answer. He'd kept a man in a cage for 3 weeks without trial, without even knowing who he was. Where I come from, that's not justice, she pressed. Where you come from don't matter. This is Foul Ridge. I know how you do things. Eleanor's voice turned to steel. I've seen it before. My husband was murdered by men who did things their way. The law looked the other way because the killers were respected men. She locked eyes with the sheriff. Is that what's happening here? The crowd grew restless, their mood turning ugly. But Eleanor had already committed. The moment she saw the truth in those storm-gray eyes, she had stepped onto a path with no turning back. She moved closer to the cage, so close that the man could have reached through and grabbed her. He didn't move a muscle. Sir, she said, her voice soft, speaking only to him now. I don't know your story. I don't know what brought you here. But I know injustice when I see it, and I know loneliness. She held up the ring so he could see it clearly. I'm offering you a chance. It's not much. I have no home, no family, nothing but the clothes on my back, but I'm offering it freely. His eyes, full of a weariness that matched her own, held hers. The entire town seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Slowly, so slowly she almost missed it, he gave a single, deliberate nod. Eleanor spun back to the sheriff, her heart pounding. There, he's agreed. Now open this cage. I can't just... Yes, you can. Her voice cracked like a whip across the square. You've held him without trial, without evidence. I am offering to take full legal responsibility for him. I am offering to remove him from your town, unless you want to explain to the circuit judge why you denied a woman her legal right to marry and held a man without due process. The sheriff's face was a thundercloud. He was trapped, and he knew it. He had played fast and loose with the law, and now this strange, determined woman was calling his bluff in front of the whole town. The law he'd ignored to cage the man was the same law that now forced his hand. You're insane, he declared. Perhaps, Eleanor replied coolly. But insanity isn't illegal. Neither is marriage. Just then, a man pushed through the crowd. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with an air of authority. Eleanor's stomach tightened. This was trouble. The law? The man sneered. That creature murdered my brother, Tom Garrett. He was checking his trap lines, innocent as a lamb, when that animal attacked him. Were you there, Mr. Garrett? Eleanor asked, her voice quiet but firm. The man's face darkened. I didn't need to be. We found Tom's body not 50 yards from where the savage made his den, blood still on his hands. And did anyone see what happened? Any witnesses? The only witness is sitting in that cage, Garrett roared. And he won't talk. He won't even defend himself. What innocent man refuses to speak? Eleanor turned back to the man in the cage. He had raised his head fully now. There was a raw intelligence in his eyes. He understood every word. Sometimes, she said, her voice carrying a profound sadness, grief takes our voices. Sometimes pain runs so deep that words become meaningless. She thought of the long, silent months after her own husband's death. Grief? A woman in the crowd shrieked. What grief excuses what we found in that cave? The bones, the belongings of missing travelers. Old bones, the sheriff corrected gruffly. Years old. Could have been anyone's. But the story was out, feeding the crowd's fear. Eleanor kept her eyes locked on the prisoner. Sir, she said gently, I need to know. Did you harm the Garrett family? The women? The children? For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing. Then slowly the man shook his head. The chains rattled. It's a sound like distant, lonely thunder. He's lying! Garrett surged forward, but his friends held him back. He didn't speak, Eleanor pointed out. He answered my question, and I choose to believe him. She turned back to the sheriff. You found old bones, a wagon, and this man near a body. It's all circumstantial. It's not enough to hang a man. This is our town, our law, the sheriff repeated, his patience gone. Then your law should protect all men equally. Eleanor's voice soared with conviction, especially those who can't speak for themselves. She reached into her bag again, this time pulling out a small leather folder. These are my papers. Eleanor Hayes, widow, 27 years old, of sound mind and body. I have the legal right to marry, and I am exercising it. Now. The crowd was buzzing. Whispers spread like fire. She's the one Morrison was supposed to marry. Traveled all this way alone. Must be desperate. Or crazy. Eleanor let them talk. She looked the sheriff dead in the eye. I'm not asking you to free him unconditionally. I'm offering to take him away. If he proves dangerous, it's on my head. But if you hang an innocent man because fear made you see a monster where there was only grief, that blood will be on all of your hands. Sheriff Bradley wavered. She could see it in the way his hand went to his badge, the way his eyes darted from her to the crowd to the cage. He was a man drowning in a situation he couldn't control. Even if I agreed, he said finally, grasping at straws, we'd need a minister, and Reverend Walsh won't perform a wedding for him. It was a good point, a fatal flaw in her plan. The crowd relaxed, sensing victory. The show was over. But then a new voice cut through the murmurs. Then I will. The crowd parted to reveal an old man leaning heavily on a walking stick. Eleanor recognized him as Judge Patrick O'Brien, the town's retired justice of the peace. Judge O'Brien, the sheriff stammered, you can't be serious. I've been watching from my window, the judge said, his voice raspy but clear, and I've been listening to this young woman speak more sense than I've heard in this town for months. He limped forward, his sharp eyes studying Eleanor. You truly wish to do this? To marry a man you know nothing about? I know he's been caged for 3 weeks without trial, Eleanor replied. I know he's been condemned without speaking a word in his own defense, and I know what it's like to lose everything and have no one believe your truth. Judge O'Brien nodded slowly. He turned his gaze to the prisoner. And you, young man, do you consent to this marriage? The man in the cage lifted his shackled hands. With great effort, he pressed his palms together and inclined his head, a gesture of acceptance. He consents, the judge declared. Sheriff, open the cage. Judge, I can't. Open it, Bradley, O'Brien commanded, his voice gaining strength. Or prepare to explain to the circuit court why you held a man without charges and then denied him his legal rights. The choice is yours. The sheriff's face was a mask of fury, but he was beaten. He fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking with rage. The crowd surged back as he unlocked the heavy door, as if expecting the prisoner to explode out in a burst of violence. Stay back, the sheriff ordered the prisoner. Any sudden moves, and I'll shoot you where you stand. The man moved slowly to the far side of the cage, his head slightly bowed. The iron door creaked open. Out, the sheriff commanded. Slow and easy. The prisoner emerged into the fading daylight. He was taller than Eleanor had expected, broad-shouldered despite weeks of captivity. His clothes were rags, but it was his face that held her. Angular features, a strong jaw hidden by a thick beard, and those storm-gray eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrow in the world. The shackles stay on, the sheriff announced, until you're out of my town. Eleanor stepped forward, holding her wedding ring. The smell of the cage, of sweat and fear, clung to him. I, Eleanor Hayes, take this man as my lawful husband, she said, her voice clear and strong. Judge O'Brien cleared his throat. And what is your name, son? The prisoner's mouth opened, then closed. His throat worked, but no sound came out. He shook his head in frustration. He can't speak, Eleanor said quickly. Or he won't. Does it matter for legal purposes? Then I'll name him. Eleanor looked deep into those gray eyes. Is that acceptable? May I give you a name for the law's sake? He studied her for a long moment, then gave a single nod. She thought of the storm in his eyes, the mountain cave where they'd found him, the sorrow that emanated from him like heat from sun-baked stone. Stone, she said. Jacob Stone. Is that acceptable? Another nod. This one seemed to carry a hint of bitter amusement. Then do you, Jacob Stone, take this woman as your lawful wife? Judge O'Brien asked. The man Jacob now raised his shackled hands again. He pointed to Eleanor, then to himself, then pressed his palms together one last time. I'll take that as consent, the judge said dryly. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I pronounce you man and wife. He turned to Eleanor, his expression grim. God help you, young woman. You may have just signed your own death warrant. Eleanor ignored him. She took the ring and reached for Jacob's hand. He flinched at her touch but held still as she slipped it onto his smallest finger. It was the only one it would fit. Now get out of my town, Sheriff Bradley growled. Both of you. And if I so much as hear... We're going, Eleanor cut him off. She turned to face the stunned, silent crowd one last time. I hope you all sleep well tonight, knowing you would have hanged a man who couldn't even speak to defend himself. She picked up her carpet bag and started walking toward the edge of town. Behind her, she heard the soft shuffle of bare feet on dust and the rhythmic clink of chains. Her husband, Jacob Stone, was following her. At the town's border, Eleanor stopped and turned. The crowd had followed, keeping their distance, watching to make sure they really left. The shackles, she called to the sheriff. You said they come off when we leave town. When you're well away, he shouted back. Send them back with the next traveler you meet, or I'll hunt you both down. Anger flared in her, but she swallowed it. They needed distance. She looked at Jacob, standing in the dying light with chains on his wrists and her ring on his finger. Can you walk, aren't she asked. We need to put miles between us and them before dark. He nodded, gesturing down the dark road with his bound hands. The message was clear. Lead the way. Eleanor shouldered her bag and started walking into the wilderness. Behind them, Foul Ridge disappeared into the dust. Ahead lay only the unknown road and the silent, shackled man, who was now her husband. She had traded her last possession for his freedom. Now came the hard part, finding out if she had saved an innocent man or chained herself to a monster. The sun dipped below the mountains, and the long, cold night began. They walked until the sky was a blanket of stars and the trail was a treacherous shadow. Eleanor's feet ached, but she didn't dare stop. Behind her, the steady clink of Jacob's chains was a constant reminder of their precarious freedom. Finally, when she could barely lift her boots, she stopped near a cluster of juniper trees. We'll camp here, she said, her voice rough with exhaustion. Jacob stood at the edge of the firelight she was trying to build, maintaining a careful distance, like a stray dog expecting a kick. He hadn't come within 10 feet of her since they left town. I'm going to gather more wood, she said. He shook his head sharply and, despite the shackles, began collecting dried branches with a practiced efficiency. He built the fire lay with a precision that surprised her. Before she could even offer her matches, he had found 2 stones and was striking them together. Sparks flew, a tiny flame caught, and soon a small fire was pushing back the desert chill. Eleanor unpacked her meager supplies, a blanket, some hardtack, dried beef, and a canteen of water. She laid them out between them. It was an offering of peace. Jacob looked at the food, then rose and melted into the darkness. A flicker of fear went through Eleanor. Had he run? Was the town right about him? But he returned moments later, his cupped hands holding several prickly pear fruits. Using a flat stone, he expertly scraped away the spines and offered one to her. The sweet juice was a blessing on her dry tongue. "Thank you," she said. He just nodded and prepared another. They ate in silence. When they were done, Eleanor pulled out her sewing kit. "Those clothes are falling apart," she said. "I can at least mend the worst of it." He looked down at his tattered shirt as if seeing it for the first time. A hint of embarrassment crossed his face. He hesitated, then moved closer to the fire, turning his back to her so she could work on a long tear down his side. Through the rips in the fabric, she saw a landscape of old scars. Some looked like claw marks. Others were the clean lines of a knife. "You've survived a lot," she said quietly. As she sewed, she found herself talking, filling the silence with her own story. "My first husband was named James. He was a good man, too gentle. Men who wanted our land shot him in the back while he was plowing. They called it a hunting accident." Her needle paused. "The man who did it sat in church every Sunday after that, smiling at me." Jacob turned his head slightly. He was listening. "That's when I answered Samuel Morrison's advertisement," she finished, her voice bitter. "A new start, he promised. Instead, I found another town full of people ready to hang a man without knowing his truth." He was looking at her directly now, and in the flickering firelight, she saw something new in his eyes. Understanding. "I know you have a story too," she said. "When you're ready, I'll listen." She finished the last stitch and tied off the thread. He examined her neat handiwork, then surprised her. He reached for her carpet bag and pointed to the handle, which was nearly torn off. He held out his shackled hands. She passed him the bag and he began to repair it, using his teeth and bound hands to reweave the failing leather with incredible skill. "You know leatherwork?" she asked. He nodded. "Were you a craftsman?" His hands stilled. He set the bag down and held up his palms to the fire. Even under the grime, she could see the deep, patterned calluses of a man who worked with tools. He pointed to the fire, then made a hammering motion. "A blacksmith?" He tilted his hand back and forth. "Close." He picked up a stick and drew the outline of a horseshoe in the dirt, adding intricate decorative curls to the design. "An artist," she whispered, "not just a tradesman." A flicker of something, pride or maybe pain, crossed his face. He quickly scrubbed the drawing away and handed her the repaired bag. The handle was stronger than new. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged, then gestured to his mended shirt. Fair trade. The fire was dying, and the desert cold was setting in. Eleanor pulled out her single thin blanket. "We'll share," she said. "It's not proper, but out here, propriety seems foolish." He shook his head firmly, pointing to himself, then to the bare ground. "You'll freeze," she insisted, spreading the blanket near the fire. "There's room enough." He hesitated, then slowly lay down on the very edge of the blanket, his back to her. Eleanor settled down a careful distance away, pulling the blanket over them both. The chains clinked softly as he tried to get comfortable. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his shoulder. He flinched so violently he almost threw the blanket off. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to startle you. The shackles must hurt." He went rigid then, almost imperceptibly, he relaxed. "Tomorrow we'll get them off," she promised. They lay in silence under the vast sea of stars. Strangers bound by a bizarre ceremony, sharing a single blanket against the cold. "Jacob," she whispered, not sure if he was awake. A slight movement told her he was listening. "I don't expect anything from this. You're free now. Once those shackles are off, if you want to leave, I won't stop you." He shifted, turning just enough for her to see his profile in the ember's glow. He pointed to her, then to himself, then pressed his palms together, just as he had in the town square. It was a promise. He was staying. "All right then," she whispered back. "We'll figure it out together." He turned away again, but the distance between them felt smaller now. The fire burned to embers, a coyote howled in the distance, and two broken people began the slow, cautious work of learning to trust again, alone in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The question still hung in the cold night air. Who had she truly married? Dawn broke, painting the rocks in shades of rose and gold. Eleanor woke to find the blanket tucked carefully around her. Jacob was gone. Panic seized her. But then she saw him by the dead fire, his back to her. He had found a sharp-edged stone and was furiously grinding it against the lock of one of the shackles. The chain was stretched taut between his wrists, which were raw and bleeding from the effort. "Let me help," she said, scrambling up. He shook his head, not breaking his rhythm. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was the sound of a man clawing his way back to freedom. She brought over her small tin of salve. "At least let me tend those wounds." He paused, then held out his hands. As she cleaned the abraded skin, she saw his scars more clearly in the morning light. Burns, cuts, the marks of a lifetime spent wrestling with hot metal. When she finished, he immediately went back to his task. By the time the sun was fully up, there was a loud click. One shackle sprang open. Jacob stared at his freed hand as if it were a stranger. He flexed his fingers, a look of pure relief on his face. He attacked the second lock with renewed vigor, and soon it too fell away, landing in the dust with a final, satisfying clank. He stood there, rubbing his wrists, rolling his shoulders, feeling the unfamiliar lightness. Then he picked up the hated chains, and with a roar of pure, pent-up fury, he smashed them against a large boulder. Again and again, he slammed the iron against the rock, the canyon echoing with the violent sounds until the metal was a twisted, unrecognizable wreck. He stood panting, rage pouring off him in waves. Finally, he hurled the mangled steel into a deep ravine and turned back to her, his chest heaving. The storm in his eyes had broken. He took her hand in both of his, a brief, grateful touch, then pulled away, all business again. They traveled all morning, following the trail higher into the foothills. Without the chains, Jacob moved with a long, confident stride. He scouted ahead, always checking on her, always returning to her side. As the sun beat down, Eleanor's worn boots began to torture her feet. When she stumbled for the third time, Jacob stopped. He pointed to a shady spot, then to her feet. "Rest." "I'm fine," she insisted. He gently but firmly guided her to the shade, knelt and removed her boot. Blisters were already forming. He looked at her with concern, then held up a finger. "Wait," and disappeared. He returned with strips of soft bark from a cottonwood tree, showing her how to wrap them around her feet for cushioning. The relief was immediate. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Eleanor gasped. Below them lay a small, sheltered valley with a creek running through it. She recognized it from Samuel Morrison's letters, her promised land. But where a cabin should have been, there was only an abandoned foundation. A few logs stacked, a hole dug into the hillside, a broken start to a broken dream. "He never even finished it," she said, her voice hollow. Jacob stood beside her, his eyes scanning the valley. Then he touched her shoulder and pointed. Tucked away near the creek was the pathetic dugout shelter, the roof half finished, a gaping hole for a door. Inside, the air was stale with failure. "The bones of something are here, I suppose," she said, trying to find a sliver of hope. Jacob examined the structure with a professional eye, testing the supports, checking the joints. He looked at her, then made a building motion with his hands. A question. "Do you want to finish it?" "With what?" she asked, gesturing at her near-empty bag. "I have $17 to my name. No tools, no supplies." He held up his own two hands, then pointed to the forest, the creek, the rocks. "I have skills, nature has materials." He was offering to help her build. "Why?" she asked. He walked to a patch of dusty sunlight on the floor and drew in the dirt. A simple house, two stick figures beside it. He pointed to her, then to himself, then to the drawing. "A home?" she whispered. "You're saying we could make a home?" He nodded, a rare small smile transforming his face. He began to sketch again, adding a garden, a corral, smoke rising from a chimney. A life. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. This silent, broken man was offering to build the dream another had only promised her. "All right," she said. "We'll try." His smile widened. He began pacing off dimensions, his mind already working. He grabbed a stick and started drawing more detailed plans in the dirt. But as he drew, his expression changed. The enthusiasm drained from his face, replaced by a shadow. His hands slowed, then stopped. He stared at the drawing as if seeing a ghost. "Jacob!" He stood abruptly and walked out of the shelter, striding to the creek's edge where he stood, rigid, his fists clenched. Eleanor followed, a sense of dread creeping over her. "What is it? What's wrong?" He turned to her, and the raw pain in his eyes was a physical blow. He pointed back at the shelter, made the building motion, then drew a sharp, violent line across his own throat. Building. Death. He pointed to himself, then covered his face with his hands. A wave of understanding washed over Eleanor. He had done this before. He had built a home, and it had been destroyed. "Your family," she said softly. "You lost them." His nod was barely perceptible. He knelt by the water and picked up a handful of pebbles. He arranged them carefully. One large stone, two smaller ones, a man and two children. Then he added another stone, slightly apart. A woman. He pointed to the woman's stone, then mimed cradling a baby. She had died in childbirth. He scattered those stones violently, then arranged new ones. The man and two children, surrounded by a ring of many other stones. He picked up a stick and made vicious, stabbing motions at the three stones in the center. "Raiders!" Eleanor breathed. He nodded. He touched the large stone, himself, and mimed fighting, hopelessly outnumbered. Then he gently touched the two small stones and covered them with dirt, his hands shaking uncontrollably. His children, buried. The full weight of his silence, his grief, his wildness, crashed down on her. But he wasn't finished. He pointed back to the half-built shelter, then to his own throat again. He made a building motion, then wrapped his hands around his neck as if in a noose. The message was horrifying. After losing his family, he had tried to build again, somewhere else, and for his trouble, they had tried to hang him. "Foul Ridge," she whispered in horror. "They tried to hang you before. Not for murder. For being a grieving man they didn't understand." He nodded slowly, touching the faint rope scars on his neck she hadn't noticed before. "And you stopped speaking after they—" He shook his head. He pointed to the two small piles of dirt where he'd buried the pebbles representing his children. He touched his throat. The words had died with them. Then he mimed one more scene. Someone approaching his mountain cave. He held up his hands, defending himself against an attack. "Tom Garrett," she said. "He came for you. You fought back." A firm, definite nod. He showed her how Garrett had come at him with a weapon, how years of solitude and fear had made him react with the ferocity of a cornered animal. "It was self-defense," she said, the last piece falling into place. "Just as I thought." Jacob stood, brushing the dirt from his hands. He looked at the abandoned shelter, his face a war of desire and memory. The need to build was fighting the trauma of what building had cost him. "It doesn't have to be the same," Eleanor said quietly. "I'm not her, and you're not the man you were. We're different now. We're survivors." He looked at her for a long, searching moment. Then he walked back to the shelter and picked up the stick. This time, as he drew the plans for their home, his hand was steady. He glanced up at her occasionally, a silent question in his eyes, including her in the process. They weren't just building a cabin. They were building a fortress against the past. One log, one stone, one shared look at a time. That night, by a fire crackling in what would someday be their hearth, he found a piece of charcoal. On a flat stone, he drew a woman's profile, Eleanor's, looking not back but forward, into an empty space waiting to be filled. He handed it to her, then did something that stunned her more than any drawing could. He spoke, a single word, rough with disuse, a ghost of a sound. "Home?" The question in it broke her heart and mended it all at once. "Yes," she said, her own voice thick with tears. "Home." 3 weeks of grueling work transformed the dugout into a shelter. They had a roof, a door, and a rhythm to their days. But their supplies were dwindling. They had to go to the nearest town, Cedar Falls, a day's ride north. The thought filled them both with dread. Jacob had traded his blacksmithing skills for an old mule from a traveling peddler, fixing the man's broken wagon wheel in exchange for the stubborn beast. As they prepared to leave for town, Eleanor saw the tension return to Jacob's posture. He was a wild thing being forced back toward the trap. The trail led through a narrow canyon, the red rock walls closing in around them. Jacob walked ahead, leading the mule Eleanor rode. He had insisted, if there was trouble, she could flee faster. Halfway through the canyon, the mule's ears flattened. Jacob froze. Hoofbeats. Fast. Coming up behind them. He yanked the mule to the side, placing himself between Eleanor and the approaching riders. His hand went to the knife at his belt, their only weapon. 3 men rounded the bend. The lead rider's face was a sneer of triumph. Eleanor's blood ran cold. It was Marcus Garrett, brother of the man Jacob had killed. "Well, well," Garrett said, his horse dancing nervously. "The beast and his bride. Knew you'd crawl out of your hole eventually." His 2 companions fanned out, blocking the trail. All 3 men were heavily armed. "We want no trouble," Eleanor said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to keep it steady. "Trouble's what you got when your man there murdered my brother in cold blood," Garrett snarled, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Sheriff Bradley might be a coward, but family justice runs deeper than the law." "It was self-defense," Eleanor insisted. "Your brother attacked him." Jacob stepped forward slightly, shielding her more completely. His body was coiled like a spring, ready to fight a battle he couldn't possibly win. "So says the woman who married a monster to save her own skin," Garrett mocked. "Step away from him, woman. This ain't your fight." Eleanor slid from the mule's back. But instead of moving away, she stepped to Jacob's side. "I am his wife. His fight is mine." "Then you're a fool who'll die with him." The canyon fell silent, the air thick and heavy. Garrett's thumb hooked over the hammer of his gun. This was it. Suddenly, Jacob did something no one expected. He moved slowly, deliberately, reaching into his worn shirt. Garrett's men tensed, their own guns appearing in their hands. But Jacob didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a small, crudely carved wooden horse, worn smooth from years of handling, a child's toy. He held it up for Garrett to see. Then he pointed to himself and made a gentle, cradling motion with his arms. "I was a father. I have lost family. I know your grief." "What's that supposed to mean?" Garrett demanded, but his voice had lost its hard edge. The raw, undeniable proof of Jacob's own tragedy had pierced his armor of rage. "He lost his children," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "His entire family. They were murdered by raiders. He knows what it is to want revenge, to need someone to blame. But killing him won't bring your brother back. It will just add more blood to blood that has already been spilled." The tension in the canyon shifted. Garrett's companions exchanged uneasy glances. "Marcus," one of them said quietly. "Tom, he always was hot-headed. You know that." "He was my brother," Garrett roared, but the conviction was fading. Jacob surprised them all again. He knelt in the dust, not in surrender, but in a profound act of communication. He drew 2 figures in the dirt facing each other. He showed one falling. Then he pointed to himself and covered his face with his hands. He wasn't admitting guilt. He was expressing sorrow. Sorrow for the death, sorrow for the necessity of it, sorrow for Garrett's pain. Garrett stared at the kneeling man, at the silent apology offered in the dust. This wasn't the snarling beast he'd imagined. This was a man drowning in a grief as deep as his own. Something inside him broke. "Get up," he said, his voice rough. "Get up, damn you." Jacob rose slowly. "I should kill you," Garrett said, his hand tightening on his gun, then loosening. "But I saw what you did to those shackles. Found them in the ravine, beaten to scrap. Only a man who'd been caged unjustly would have that much rage stored up at a set of chains." He looked from Jacob to Eleanor. "And my brother." He'd been hearing stories about a blacksmith who lost his family up north and disappeared into the mountains with a fortune. Tom got it in his head that the wild man was that blacksmith, and he went up there looking for gold. Garrett's mouth twisted. Greed killed him as much as anything. He spat in the dust. "Get out of here, but know this. That land you're on, Morrison's old claim, Tom wanted that land. He was partners with Morrison before he disappeared. That's why he was snooping around there in the first place." He reined his horse around. "Just watch your backs." Not everyone will be as understanding as I am. The riders galloped away, leaving Eleanor and Jacob standing in a cloud of dust, the revelation hanging between them. Samuel Morrison, Tom Garrett. They had been partners. The man who had lured her west was connected to the man Jacob had been forced to kill. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a web, and they were caught in the middle of it. They continued to Cedar Falls, the encounter with Garrett casting a long shadow. The town was smaller than Foul Ridge, but the whispers followed them. The story of the wild man and his bride had traveled fast. At the general store, people gave them a wide berth. While Eleanor bought their supplies, Jacob waited outside. A small girl, no older than 6, approached him, fascinated. Her mother stood nearby, ready to snatch her away. "Mister," the girl said, holding out a penny, "this is for carrots for your mule. He looks tired." Jacob froze. He knelt down to her level. Instead of taking the penny, he reached into his pocket and pulled out another small carving, a tiny wooden bird. He offered it to the child. Her face lit up. "Look, Mama!" she cried. "He made me a bird." The mother approached cautiously, but seeing her daughter's delight, she managed a small smile. "Thank you," she said to Jacob. "That's very kind." As they loaded their supplies to leave, Eleanor saw the mother whispering to another woman. But it wasn't the fearful gossip from before. It was something new. Wonder. The journey home was quiet. As their valley came into view, the half-built cabin a welcome sight, a sense of relief washed over Eleanor. They had survived. They had faced down the past and returned with what they needed to build their future. But Garrett's words echoed in her mind. Morrison and Garrett were partners. Her phantom fiancé wasn't just a ghost. He was a piece of a much larger, more dangerous puzzle. And she had a sinking feeling that one day he would come back to claim his peace. They weren't just building a home, they were building a fort. And winter was coming. Autumn winds bit with the promise of snow as they made their second trip to Cedar Falls. The shelter was now a sturdy, respectable cabin, a testament to months of relentless work. This time the town greeted them differently. The story of the wooden bird, combined with tales from the peddler about Jacob's skill, had softened people's fear into a cautious respect. At the general store, Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, even nodded. "Mrs. Stone! Mr. Stone!" Eleanor was taken aback by the formal address. While Henderson gathered their winter supplies, she noticed a "Help Wanted" sign in the window. "My back's not what it used to be," Henderson admitted. "Need a strong man for heavy lifting and deliveries." Eleanor looked at Jacob, who was examining a set of new chisels with a craftsman's eye. "My husband is very strong," she said, "and completely reliable." Henderson looked doubtful. "He'd have to deal with customers, and he don't speak." Just then the shop bell chimed. A woman entered, supporting an old man whose cane had snapped. Before Henderson could say a word, Jacob stepped forward. He took the broken cane, his eyes assessing the damage. With a questioning glance at Henderson, who nodded, Jacob selected a strip of leather, some small nails, and a metal bracket from the shelves. In minutes, working with a swift, silent efficiency that mesmerized the small crowd in the store, he had not only repaired the cane but reinforced it, wrapping the handle in leather for a better grip. He handed it back to the old man, who tested it with a look of astonishment. "Why, it's better than new!" he exclaimed. Henderson stared at Jacob, then at Eleanor, a new understanding dawning on his face. "Can he start tomorrow?" he asked. $1.50 a day, plus he can take home any damaged goods he can fix." As they were finalizing the arrangement, a shout erupted from the street. A heavy freight wagon had overturned, pinning the driver beneath it. Men rushed to help, but the wagon was too heavy. Jacob didn't hesitate. He ran outside and took charge, not with words but with action. Using hand signals and sheer force of will, he organized the would-be rescuers, showed them how to use a plank for leverage, and directed a coordinated lift. In minutes, the driver was pulled free, his leg injured but not crushed. The crowd that had gathered murmured in appreciation. Men who had once eyed Jacob with suspicion now clapped him on the shoulder. He had proven his worth in a way words never could. That was well done. Eleanor turned. Marcus Garrett was standing on the boardwalk watching them. Her hand flew to Jacob's arm, but Garrett held up a hand in peace. "I ain't here for trouble," he said. "I asked around after we last met. About a blacksmith up in the northern settlements. Man named Josiah Brennan lost his wife and two small children to a Comanche raid about 5 years back. Folks said he was a genius with metal, but went mad with grief and disappeared into the mountains. Jacob had gone completely still, his face a pale mask. Garrett's eyes softened with something like pity. They said he vanished, but maybe he just needed to find his way back to the world. I won't spread your name around. A man's got a right to bury his past. He looked at Jacob directly. I hope you find your peace, Brennan, or Stone, or whoever you need to be. He tipped his hat to Eleanor and walked away, leaving them reeling in the middle of the street. Josiah Brennan. He had a name. He had a past. And now he had a job. He had a place in the world again. That night back in their valley, Eleanor found him standing in the cabin doorway, watching the sunrise. Josiah, she said softly. He turned, his face wet with tears he made no effort to hide. But he nodded. It was true. Would you prefer I call you that? He shook his head. He picked up a piece of charcoal and wrote on a smooth plank of wood. Josiah died with them. Jacob was born in the cage. Eleanor stood beside him, her presence a silent comfort. He looked at her, his eyes full of a gratitude that words couldn't express. Then he spoke, his voice rusty but clear, the first full sentence she had ever heard him utter. Thank you for seeing me. The words seemed to unlock something deep inside him. The dam of his silence, built of grief and trauma, had finally begun to crack. I should check the roof, he managed a moment later, the practical words a lifeline back to the present. Rain's coming. I'll help, she said, her heart soaring. We're partners in this, remember? He nodded, and the ghost of a real smile touched his lips. He was no longer just the silent man from the cage. He was Jacob Stone, a craftsman with a job, and Josiah Brennan, a father who was finally beginning to heal. He was both. He was whole. They were building more than a cabin. They were rebuilding a man. Winter descended, blanketing the valley in pristine silence. The cabin was a fortress of warmth against the cold, thanks to the stone fireplace Jacob had built with the precision of a master mason. Jacob's 3 days a week in town provided them with a steady income, enough for luxuries like glass windows and thick wool blankets. More importantly, it had slowly integrated him into the community. He was no longer the wild man, but Stone, the quiet fella at Henderson's who can fix anything. His voice returned slowly, in fragments at first, then in short, carefully constructed sentences. He spoke of practical things, the weather, the quality of a piece of wood, the need to bank the fire for the night. The past remained a locked room. One afternoon, Eleanor heard horses. It was Dr. Morrison from town, and with him was a young woman, heavily pregnant and pale with distress. Found her on the road, the doctor explained. Wagon broke an axle. The baby's coming. Jacob took one look and sprang into action, stoking the fire, boiling water, his movements sure and steady. The woman, Sarah, was terrified. This was her first child, and it was coming early, in a stranger's cabin, with a storm brewing outside. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and encouragement. Jacob, who had retreated to a corner, watched with an agonizing intensity. Eleanor saw his hand go to his chest, where the carved horse was always tucked away. He was reliving his own past, the birth of his own children. Sensing his turmoil, Sarah looked at him between contractions. I'm glad you're here, she gasped. Both of you. I was so scared. To Eleanor's astonishment, Jacob spoke, his voice clear and comforting. You're safe now. When the baby finally arrived, a healthy girl, the tiny cabin was filled with her lusty cries. Just then, the door burst open and a frantic man, Sarah's husband Tom, stumbled in, his face a mask of fear that melted into overwhelming relief. I don't know how to thank you, he wept, kneeling by his wife and newborn daughter. Neighbors help neighbors, Eleanor said simply. The Winters family stayed for 3 days while the storm raged. The cabin, once a shelter for 2 solitary souls, was now filled with the warmth of a young family. Tom, a carpenter himself, struck up an easy friendship with Jacob, filling the silence with talk of building plans and homesteading dreams. On the second night, Eleanor woke to find Jacob sitting by the fire, the sleeping baby, named Hope, cradled in his arms. He held her with a practiced gentleness that broke Eleanor's heart. "She trusts you," Eleanor whispered, sitting beside him. "I had forgotten," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "How light they are. How perfect." "Tell me about them," she urged gently. "Your children." And for the first time he did. Haltingly, painfully, he spoke their names. Mary was 6. She loved to watch me work. David was 4. Quiet, like me. His voice broke. Their mother died when David was born. I thought that was the worst pain. I was wrong. He recounted the raid, the screams, the fire. The words poured out of him, a torrent of grief held back for 5 long years. "I was too late," he finished, his shoulders shaking. "It wasn't your fault," she said fiercely. "My head knows that," he whispered, touching his temple. "But my heart still burns." He looked from the sleeping baby in his arms to Eleanor. "When you stood in that square, you saw something I'd forgotten existed, the possibility of being human again." After the Winters family left, the cabin felt too quiet. That evening, Jacob led Eleanor to the small shed he'd built, where he'd been working on a secret project. Inside, gleaming in the lantern light, was a cradle. It was a masterpiece of woodwork, with roses carved into the headboard, and rockers so smooth they seemed to float. "I started it weeks ago," he said quietly. "I didn't know why. I just needed to build something beautiful again." Eleanor ran her hand over the polished oak. This wasn't just furniture. It was a statement. It was hope, carved from wood. "It's for you," he said, his voice uncertain. "For us. If—" He couldn't finish. They had been husband and wife for months, sharing a bed for warmth, but never crossing the invisible line drawn by their shared trauma. "Jacob," she said softly, "after my first husband died, I lost a child. The doctor wasn't sure if I could ever have another." "It doesn't matter," he said instantly, his voice firm. "Family can be made in other ways. If children come, it is a blessing. If not—" He gestured at the workshop, the cabin, the life they were building. "We build other things. Good things. Together." He took her hand, the first time he had ever initiated such a touch. It wasn't the gesture of a stranger or a partner out of necessity. It was the touch of a husband. "Together," she agreed, her own voice choked with emotion. He led her back to the cabin. The empty cradle stood in the corner, not as a symbol of what was missing, but as a quiet promise of whatever the future might hold. That night, as the winter wind howled outside, he pulled her close. "Eleanor," he whispered, "you saved me. Not from the cage, from myself, from becoming the monster they thought I was." "We saved each other," she whispered back. "That's what love does." He held her tighter, and she felt him smile against her hair. "Love," he repeated, the word new and strange and wonderful on his tongue. "Yes, love." Spring came, and with it, a letter from Ohio. The men who had murdered her first husband, James, had been arrested for another crime. The prosecutor wanted Eleanor to return and testify. Her testimony could finally bring justice for James. Jacob read the letter, his face grim. "You should go," he said without hesitation. "But what about us? Our home?" "James deserves justice. You deserve to see it done," he said, his eyes steady. "I will be here when you return." The thought of leaving him, of returning to the world of her past, terrified her. "Come with me." He flinched, his hand instinctively going to the carved horse at his chest. "Too many ghosts there," he whispered. Ohio was too close to Indiana, where Josiah Brennan had lost his world. "Then I'll stay." "No," he said firmly. "You'll always wonder. Go speak your truth, then come home." The goodbye at the stagecoach was quiet and agonizing. For two people who had built a life on presence, the prospect of absence was a physical pain. "I'll write," he promised, loud enough for the other passengers to hear. Then, ignoring the onlookers, he pulled her into a fierce embrace. "Come back," he whispered. "Always," she promised. The trial was an ordeal, forcing her to relive the darkest days of her past. But she was no longer the broken widow who had fled Ohio. She was Eleanor Stone, a woman who had faced down a mob, married a caged man, and built a home in the wilderness. Her testimony was unshakable. The men were found guilty, and Jacob wrote short, simple letters that were more precious to her than gold. Workshop finished. Made you a spinning wheel. Tom talks too much. I miss your bread. And you? Town asked me to make a new church bell. Said yes. Your voice would make it ring sweeter. Come home. The 2 months stretched to 3. When she finally boarded the stagecoach heading west, she felt like a bird escaping its cage. Every mile brought her closer to home, closer to him. She expected to hire a horse in Cedar Falls for the final leg of the journey, but he was there, waiting for her on the platform, holding the reins of their mule. How did you know us? She cried. Felt it, he said simply, lifting her down from the coach. Knew you'd keep your promise. As they rode into their valley at dusk, she saw the changes. The workshop was complete, new fences stood strong, and the cabin, he had added a porch, with 2 rocking chairs waiting. You've been busy, she managed. Empty house echoes too much, he said. He helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist. Did you find what you needed? Justice was served, she said, but what I needed was here all along. She reached into her bag and pulled out her old wedding ring, the one she had used to buy his freedom. I went to James's grave, she told him. I left this there. I told him I had found love again. Different, but no less true. He stared at her, his storm gray eyes wide. In all their time together, they had never dared to name the feeling that had grown between them. Jacob, she began, her voice trembling. I know this started as a marriage of necessity, but these months apart. He silenced her with a kiss. Not a kiss of comfort or partnership, but a kiss of deep, undeniable love, born of shared hardship and quiet understanding. When they finally broke apart, he reached into his own pocket. Made this while you were gone, he said, his voice thick. He unwrapped a small cloth to reveal a ring he had forged himself. It wasn't gold, but a braid of different metals. Iron for strength, silver for beauty, copper for warmth. It's strong, he said, like what we built here. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Eleanor Stone, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I don't have fancy words, but you brought me back to life. You showed me how to build again, how to trust again, how to love again. He slowly reached up, untied the leather cord from around his neck, and took off the small carved horse. He placed it in her hand. This was my past, he said. You are my future. Tears streamed down her face. I'll have you any way you come, she whispered, silent or speaking, broken or whole. You're my husband, my partner, my home. They stood on the porch of the home they had built with their own hands under a sky full of stars. They had started as 2 strangers bound by desperation, a mail-order bride abandoned at the end of the line, and a wild man caged by a grief so profound it had stolen his voice. Through shared work and 1,000 small kindnesses, they had forged a bond stronger than any iron. They had found in each other not just a partner, but a sanctuary. They had proven that even in the harshest wilderness, in the rockiest soil, the most broken people can build the strongest homes and find their way back to love. Thank you so much for listening. This story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unexpected places. If you enjoyed this journey into the Wild West, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next tale. And in the comments below, let me know. What do you think was the single bravest thing Eleanor did? I can't wait to read your thoughts. Until next time, stay safe and keep listening for the stories hidden in the dust.